The next point, we should ensure whatever we see is clear.
That means work is being done, we can see that it is in opposite direction.
Hello learners, welcome to another segment of e-learning. I am Mrs. Chinyo and I will be taking government. Our topic is a continuation of the last topic we treated, which is separation of power. In the last lesson, if you will recall, we said separation of power means that the three arms of government, that is the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary, should remain separate in terms of their functions and in terms of their personnel, that is the staff working. Separation of powers in that context meant or means that the legislature should confer itself to lawmaking, while the executive should focus on policy implementation for good governance, while the judiciary should focus on interpretation of the law and adjudication of cases that comes before it for settlement. Equally, in the previous lesson, we said that the concept of separation of power was advanced by a French political philosopher by the name of Charles Louis Montesquieu. This philosopher decided to advance this political theory to ensure or to promote tranquility in governments, to also guarantee that the rights of citizens of a country are safeguarded, as well as to ensure that no arm of government whatsoever has unnecessary or abused its position. Now, this is in summary what we did in the last lesson. Today, we'll build on what we've done earlier. And today, our lesson will be divided into two. One, we shall be looking at separation of power in a parliamentary or cabinet system of government. And two, we shall also look at separation of power in a presidential system of government. I pray you pay attention and try to follow the lesson as much as you can. Starting with separation of power in a parliamentary system of government. In this system, that is parliamentary system, there is little or no separation of power between the various arms of governments. The practice obtained in this type of system is fusion of power. What do we mean by fusion of power? When we say fusion, it means to bring something together or to join more than one thing together. That is the meaning of fission. Now we are going to take an example of a country that practices parliamentary system of government. Then we'll see the concept of separation of power and check and balance in that system. For example, if you study British system of government, you will realize that both the executive arm, the judicial arm, are parts of the elected parliament. That is, they are drawn from the parliament. In the same light, the Chief Justice, who is known as Pro or Lord Chancellor in Britain, you will find out that he is also drawn from the elected parliament. Other top functionaries, like ministers that are serving in Britain, they are also drawn from the elected parliament. That is, you cannot become the prime minister, you cannot be the Lord Chancellor or a minister except you are first and foremost elected as a parliamentarian, that is a lawmaker. It is now from the parliament or their legislature that these important personalities are elected or drawn and appointed to serve in government. The example here shows you that the three arms of government are fused. They are all from the parliament. They are together. Now, if parliamentary system of government has no clear separation in terms of their staff or clearly stated functions, as the definition or as our definition of separation of power gave us, how then can they check one another? How can the parliament, how can the judiciary, or how can the executive in a parliamentary system of government check one another for abuses or excess use of political power? I will give you the example now. Even though the system is fused, but there is an internal mechanism inbuilt in the system to ensure that they both check one another. Example number one, for instance, the executive arm can check the legislature, that is the parliament, by deciding on when the legislature sits. It also decides on its procedures also. When the parliament is elected and inaugurated, now it is the executive, or it is left on the executive to decide on the number of sittings when the parliament will sit and the procedures that will take place in the parliament. That is, the executive has that power. And except the executive does that, no member in the parliament can stand up and say, come for sitting today or tomorrow. Now, that is a way of curtailing the powers of the parliament, even though the executive is still a part of the parliament. Example number 2. The executive arm and the legislature check the judiciary by initiating the removal of any judge, even if the judge is as highly placed as the Lord Chancellor. Once the executive and the legislature or parliament is not satisfied by the performance of such a judge, they have the power to initiate the process for his removal. Now, by so doing, it is an example that the executive arm as well as the legislature has power to curtail the excesses of the judiciary. Let us take another example. From another angle or perspective, the executive can check the judiciary through its power of prerogative of mercy, which can override a sentence passed by the judiciary on the accused or offender. We already observed previously that it is the judiciary that is saddled with the responsibility of interpreting the Constitution and applying same to individual cases that is brought before it for adjudication. Now, when such happens, an offender can be convicted if he violates the Constitution and will be sentenced. And such an offender is expected to serve the sentence as passed on him by the judiciary. But to serve as a check on the excesses of the judiciary, you realize that the Constitution has given the executive, particularly the chief executive officer, the right to commute, that is to change a sentence passed by the judiciary, because the executive has what we call prerogative of mercy. Once the executive invokes that, it can override the decision passed by the judiciary and it stands. So that is an example of check and balance that is inbuilt in the system. Another example, let us take another example. The judiciary, on its part, can act as a check on both the legislature and executive through judicial review of any administrative and legislative actions. The Constitution has empowered the judicial arm of government that at any time they can call on the legislature and the executive to bring before it certain decisions, actions, or inactions on their parts for review. Now, when the judiciary carries that review, if the need arises, they can declare that the actions performed or carried by the legislature or the executive unconstitutional, and as such will declare such an action of no effect and it stands. I want you to note, my viewers and listeners, that through the power of judicial review, any action that goes against the Constitution must be declared null and void or of non-effect, and the executive or the legislature must obey and stop that action. In this system of governments, the legislature can check the executive through its approval or otherwise of the annual appropriation bill. I am sure that most of you are conversant or familiar with the concept of budgets. Now, every year it is expected that the executive arm of government prepares and presents before the legislature the annual budget, which we call appropriation bill. The reason being, the executive has no right to implement the budget except it presents same to the legislature for scrutiny and approval. If you remember, in the last lesson, we discussed this in detail. Now, that is to show you that the legislature has the power to check even the spending of the executive arm of a country. Now, another example which is important has to do with the legislature checking the executive through its power to pass a vote of no confidence. In a parliamentary system of government, the parliament, that is the legislature, they have the power. If they are not satisfied with the performance of the executive arm of government, all they need to do is to declare or pass a vote of no confidence on the executive. And as soon as the majority do that, the executive has no choice but to vacate office and a new person or a new set elected, even though they will not lose their position in the parliament. Having discussed that, let us now focus our attention on separation of powers in a presidential system of government. In a presidential system of government, there is clear separation of power in terms of staff and their functions. There is real separation of power. For example, in Nigeria, The Constitution is supreme. Therefore, all legislation must be within its provisions. Else, the judiciary can challenge such legislative or executive action that contravenes the Constitution by declaring it of non-effect. We are talking, or we want to look at example of check and balance. Now, this example is telling you that the judiciary that interprets the Constitution can declare an action taken by the legislature or by the executive arm of government and say that such an action, once it contravenes the Constitution, null and void or of non-effect, because every action in the country is expected to be within the provision of the Nigerian Constitution. Otherwise, such an action becomes unconstitutional. Another example has to do with the power of judicial review. Any legislative or executive action that contravenes the Constitution again, when the judiciary reviews their action, is declared null and void. That is a common phrase that has reoccurred in our lesson. You look at the part of the executive has the power to veto any legislation made by lawmakers as long as 2 or less than 2/3 of the lawmakers voted for such a legislation. If 2 out of 3 lawmakers agree on a legislation, forgetting the other part, one part, the president or chief executive officer can assent and give a go ahead. That is power or veto power. We are talking about checks and balances in a system. The legislature checks the executive also in terms of appropriation bill. Any budget made by the executive, also in the presidential system, must be approved by the lawmaker before it can be executed. The legislature has the power to impeach a sitting chief executive. They have the constitutional power to impeach, that is to remove a chief executive from office. That is also an example of check. Similarly, important appointment of judges, EFCC chairman, diplomats, ministers, and the likes, such appointments must be approved by the lawmaker or by the legislatures before the appointments are lawful. Agreements entered into with foreign countries in the same light must be approved by the legislature before it becomes effective. If Nigeria wants to enter into a diplomatic relationship with Ghana, then our legislature must assent, must agree. Otherwise, we cannot enter into such a relationship. The examples are enormous. The bottom line is that there are inherent checks and balances in the system. The executive arm of government also has prerogative of mercy over the judiciary to change the verdicts already passed by the judiciary. That is also an example of checks and balance in a presidential system of government. My listeners, learners, I want to keep you busy with the following assignments. Assignment number 1, give examples of checks and balance in a parliamentary system of government. I take that again. Give examples of checks and balance in a parliamentary system of government. Assignment number 2, give examples of checks and balance in a presidential system of government. Assignment number 2, give examples of checks and balance in a presidential system of government. You would notice that I didn't give you the number. Just cite any number of examples you are comfortable with. Having done the assignment, submit to this number 081047425553. 081047425553. I remain Mrs. Chinyo. Thank you.